Some men carry pain quietly. They walk through this world with scars nobody can see, with memories that burn hotter than any fire, and with a kind of silence that most people mistake for weakness. But there are moments, rare and terrifying moments, when that silence breaks. When the man who said nothing for years finally opens his mouth. When the man who walked away from every fight finally stops walking. When the man who let the world take everything from him finally decides that the world has taken enough. This is the story of one such man. A man the world forgot. A man whose enemies laughed at. A man who lost the only friend he ever had. And this is the story of what happened when those enemies realized, far too late, that they had made the worst mistake of their miserable lives. In the year 1871, in the dry and unforgiving lands of the Arizona Territory, there lived a man whose name most people could not even pronounce. The Apache people called him Kodunai, which in their language meant the one who walks with shadows. But the white settlers and the cowboys and the miners who came to steal the land and dig up the gold, they did not care about his real name. They called him Ghost. They called him that because he moved through the desert like smoke, appearing and disappearing without a sound, and because his skin was dark and his eyes were darker, and because he frightened them in ways they could not explain. Kodunai was born into the Chiricahua Apache tribe, in a small camp hidden deep within the mountains. His mother was a healer, a woman who knew every plant and root and herb that grew in the dry soil. His father was a warrior, a man who had fought in more battles than he could count, a man whose body carried the scars of 100 fights, and whose spirit carried the weight of 1,000 losses. Kodunai was their only child, and from the moment he was born, the elders of the tribe said there was something different about him, something quiet, something watchful, something that made even the oldest and wisest among them feel a little uneasy. As a boy, Kodunai did not play with the other children. He did not run and shout and wrestle in the dirt the way the other boys did. Instead, he would sit alone at the edge of the camp, staring out into the desert, watching the way the wind moved through the brush, listening to sounds that nobody else could hear. His mother worried about him. She thought perhaps he was sick in his mind, or perhaps some spirit had touched him and left a mark that could not be washed away. But his father understood. His father looked at the boy and saw something familiar. He saw a hunter. He saw a watcher. He saw someone who was learning the world not through noise, but through silence. When Kodunai was 7 years old, something happened that changed his life forever. He was sitting at his usual spot at the edge of the camp, watching the sun go down behind the mountains, when he heard a sound. It was small and weak, barely louder than a whisper. He stood up and followed the sound into the brush, stepping carefully over rocks and thorns until he found the source. It was a wolf pup, a tiny, skinny, trembling thing, no bigger than a rabbit, lying on its side in the dust. Its fur was grey and silver and white, and its eyes were pale blue, the color of ice in winter. It was alone. Its mother was nowhere to be seen. There were no tracks, no scent, no sign of a pack. The pup was dying. Kodunai could see it in the way its ribs pushed against its skin, in the way its breathing came in short, shallow gasps, in the way its eyes were beginning to close. Without thinking, without hesitating, the boy picked up the pup and carried it back to camp. The other children stared. The women shook their heads. One of the elders, a man named Running Deer, told the boy to put the animal back where he found it. Wolves were not pets, he said. Wolves were wild things, and wild things belonged to the desert, not to the camp. But Kodunai looked at the old man with those dark, quiet eyes and said nothing. He simply turned and walked to his family shelter and laid the pup down on his own blanket. His mother looked at the animal and then looked at her son, and she saw something in his face that she had never seen before. She saw purpose. She saw love. She handed the boy a bowl of water and a strip of dried meat, and she said nothing more about it. The pup lived. Against all odds and against all expectations, the tiny creature survived. Kodunai fed it and watered it and kept it warm through the cold desert nights. He chewed meat into soft paste and pushed it into the pup's mouth with his fingers. He cleaned its fur and checked its body for ticks and thorns. He slept curled around it, his small body wrapped protectively around the animal's even smaller body. And in the mornings, when the sun rose and the camp came to life, the first thing he did was check to make sure the pup was still breathing. Weeks passed. The pup grew stronger. It began to walk, then to run, then to play. It followed Kodunai everywhere. padding along behind him on silent paws, sitting beside him when he sat, sleeping beside him when he slept. The boy named the wolf Siku, which meant ice, because of its pale blue eyes. And as the weeks turned into months and the months turned into years, the bond between the boy and the wolf grew into something that the people of the camp had never seen before. It was not the bond between a master and a pet. It was not the bond between a hunter and his dog. It was something deeper, something almost spiritual, something that made the elders whisper among themselves and shake their heads in wonder. By the time Kodonai was 15, Siku was fully grown. The wolf stood nearly 3 feet tall at the shoulder, with thick silver fur and muscles that rippled beneath its skin like water over stone. Its pale blue eyes were sharp and intelligent, and it moved with a grace and power that made even the bravest warriors step aside when it passed. But despite its size and strength, Siku was gentle. It played with the children of the camp, allowing them to climb on its back and pull its ears. It lay quietly beside the elders during council meetings, its great head resting on its paws, watching and listening as if it understood every word that was spoken. And it never left Kodonai's side. Not once. Not ever. It was during this time that Kodonai's father began to teach him the ways of the warrior. He taught him how to track animals across miles of desert. He taught him how to read the wind and the sky and the behavior of birds to predict the weather. He taught him how to fight with his hands and with a knife and with a bow. But there was one skill that Kodonai learned that set him apart from every other warrior in the tribe. One skill that would later make him a legend. His father had taken, from the body of a dead soldier, a revolver, a Colt Navy revolver, heavy and powerful, with a long barrel and a wooden grip worn smooth by years of use. Most Apache warriors had no interest in the white man's weapons. They considered them loud and clumsy and dishonorable. But Kodonai's father saw the future. He saw that the world was changing, that the old ways were dying, and that his son would need every advantage he could get to survive in the world that was coming. Oh, so he taught the boy to shoot. And what he discovered was something extraordinary. Kodonai had a gift, a natural, almost supernatural ability with the revolver. His hand was steady and his eye was sharp and his reflexes were faster than anything his father had ever seen. By the time he was 16, the boy could draw the revolver from his belt and fire 6 shots into a target the size of a man's heart in less than 3 seconds. He could shoot the head off a rattlesnake from 50 paces. He could hit a running rabbit from the back of a galloping horse. The warriors of the tribe watched him practice and they shook their heads in disbelief. They had never seen anything like it. They said the spirits had given the boy a gift. They said the wind itself guided his bullets. But Kodonai did not think of himself as special. He did not brag or boast or show off his skills. He practiced quietly, alone, with only Siku watching. And when he was done, he cleaned the revolver carefully and tucked it into his belt and went about his day as if nothing had happened. He was, in every way, the same quiet, watchful boy he had always been. The only difference was that now, when he sat at the edge of the camp and stared out into the desert, there was something new in his dark eyes, something hard, something dangerous, something that suggested the boy was becoming a man, and the man was becoming something the world was not ready for. The trouble started when Kodonai was 22 years old. By then, the white settlers had pushed deep into Apache territory. They had built towns and farms and mining camps, and they had brought with them soldiers and guns and a burning, insatiable hunger for land and gold. The Apache people had fought back. They had raided the settlements and attacked the supply trains and killed the soldiers who came to drive them away. But for every soldier they killed, 10 more arrived. For every settlement they burned, 5 more were built. The tide was turning, and everyone knew it. The old way of life was ending, and a new world, cruel and unfamiliar, was taking its place. Kodonai's tribe had managed to avoid the worst of the fighting. Their camp was hidden deep in the mountains, far from the main trails and the settlements. And their chief, a wise old man named Grey Feather, believed in peace. He did not want war. He did not want bloodshed. He wanted only to live quietly, to hunt and fish and raise his people in the old ways, and to be left alone. And for a while it seemed like this might be possible. The soldiers did not know where the camp was. The settlers did not venture into the mountains. The tribe existed in a fragile bubble of peace, untouched by the violence that was consuming the rest of the territory. But peace, as Greyfeather knew in his heart, was a temporary thing, and it was about to end. The man who would destroy everything was named Elias Cutter. He was a rancher, a big, loud, red-faced man with a thick neck and small, mean eyes. He'd come to the territory 5 years earlier with a wagon full of cattle and a head full of ambitions, and he had built himself a ranch on the flat plains at the base of the mountains. He was rich. He was powerful. He had connections in the territorial government and friends among the soldiers at the nearby fort, and he wanted more land. Specifically, he wanted the land in the mountains, the land where the Apache camp was hidden. He wanted it because there were rumors of silver in those mountains, rumors of veins so thick and rich that a man could pull the metal out of the rock with his bare hands. And Elias Cutter was the kind of man who would do anything, absolutely anything, to get what he wanted. Cutter had a group of men who worked for him. They were not cowboys. They were not ranchers. They were hired guns. Killers. Men who had been run out of other territories for crimes too ugly to talk about. The worst of them was a man named Virgil Stokes, a tall, thin man with a face like a hatchet and a reputation for cruelty that would make the devil himself flinch. Stokes had killed 11 men in gunfights, or so the story said, and he had done things to captured Apache warriors that could not be spoken of in polite company. He was Cutter's right hand, his enforcer, his weapon, and he took pleasure in his work in a way that disturbed even the other hired guns. It was Stokes who first discovered the Apache camp. He had been riding in the mountains scouting for signs of silver when he stumbled upon a trail. He followed it carefully, staying low and keeping quiet, and after several hours of climbing, he found the camp. He watched it from a distance, hidden among the rocks, and he counted the people and the shelters and the horses. And then he saw something that caught his attention. He saw Kodonai. He saw the young Apache man sitting at the edge of the camp, cleaning a revolver with the careful, practiced hands of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. And beside him, lying in the sun with its great head on its paws, was Siku, the massive silver wolf. Stokes watched them for a long time. Then he turned his horse around and rode back to the ranch to tell Cutter what he had found. Cutter was pleased. He called a meeting of his men and laid out his plan. It was simple, and it was brutal, and it was exactly what you would expect from a man like Elias Cutter. He would go to the fort and tell the commander that the Apache camp was a threat. He would say that the warriors had been raiding his cattle and threatening his workers. He would ask for soldiers to drive them out, and if the soldiers could not do it, or would not do it, then Cutter's own men would handle the problem themselves. But Stokes had a different idea. He told Cutter that the Apache man with the revolver worried him. He had seen the way the man handled the weapon, and he had heard stories from other settlers about an Apache gunslinger who could shoot faster than any white man alive. Stokes said they needed to be smart about this. They needed to weaken the man before they made their move. They needed to take something from him, something that would break his spirit and leave him vulnerable. And that was when Stokes looked at Cutter and smiled that thin, cruel smile of his, and said the words that would set everything in motion. "The wolf," he said. "We kill the wolf first." Cutter agreed. It seemed like such a small thing, such a simple, easy, safe thing. Kill an animal. What could possibly go wrong? What could one man do, even an Apache gunslinger, if they took away his pet? He would grieve. He would be weakened. And then they would move in and take the land and the silver and everything else they wanted. They had no idea what they were about to unleash. The plan was set for a night when the moon was dark. Stokes would take 3 men into the mountains, find the wolf, and kill it. Quick and quiet. No mess, no fuss, no trouble. And that would be the beginning of the end for the Apache camp and the quiet man who lived there with his pale-eyed wolf. What they did not know, what they could not possibly have known, was that the bond between Kodonai and Siku was not the bond between a man and his pet. It was the bond between 2 souls that had found each other in the wilderness and had chosen, against all reason and all odds, to walk through this world together. And when you break a bond like that, when you destroy something that sacred and that pure, you do not create grief. You do not create weakness. You create something far, far worse. The kind of rage that does not burn itself out. The kind of rage that does not fade with time. The kind of rage that sits inside a man's chest like a second heart, beating and burning and growing stronger with every breath, until the man who carries it is no longer a man at all, but something else entirely. Something ancient, something merciless, something that the world has seen before, in the eyes of storms and in the hearts of volcanoes and in the final desperate charge of a wounded animal. And in the dusty, blood-soaked history of the Arizona Territory, they would come to call this rage by a name. They would call it the Ghost's Reckoning. And it was coming. God help them all, it was coming. The night they came for Siku was a night without stars. The sky was black and heavy, like a wool blanket thrown over the world, and the air was thick with the smell of dust and dry sage. The mountains were quiet. Too quiet. Even the coyotes, who usually filled the darkness with their wild, laughing songs, were silent. It was as if the land itself knew something was coming, as if the desert was holding its breath, waiting for the terrible thing that was about to happen. Kodonai felt it. He was lying in his shelter, his back against the cool earth. Siku pressed warm and solid against his side, and he felt it in his bones. A tightness, a wrongness, a feeling like a hand closing slowly around his throat. He opened his eyes and stared at the ceiling of the shelter, listening. Siku stirred beside him. The wolf lifted its great silver head and looked at Kodonai with those pale blue eyes, and in the dim light, the man saw something in the animal's gaze that he had never seen before. It was not fear. Siku did not know fear. It was something else. It was knowing. It was acceptance. It was the look of a creature that understood, in some deep and wordless way, that its time was running short. Kodonai reached out and placed his hand on the wolf's head. The fur was warm and soft, and beneath it he could feel the steady pulse of the animal's heartbeat. He did not speak. He did not need to. The bond between them was beyond words, beyond language, beyond anything that the human mind could fully understand. It was a bond that existed in the space between breaths, in the silence between heartbeats, in the place where the physical world ended and something deeper began. They lay there together for a long time, and then, slowly, Kodonai's eyes closed, and he drifted into a restless, uneasy sleep. Virgil Stokes and his 3 men reached the edge of the camp just after midnight. They had left their horses a mile back and covered the rest of the distance on foot, moving slowly and carefully through the darkness. Stokes was in front, his long body bent low, his eyes scanning the shadows ahead. Behind him came the 3 men he had chosen for the job. Billy Pardee, a young, nervous kid from Texas who was trying to prove himself tough enough to ride with Cutter's crew. Frank Holt, a former soldier turned mercenary, a man who did what he was told and asked no questions. And Miguel Vega, a tracker from Mexico who could follow a trail across bare rock and who carried a long skinning knife on his belt that he kept sharp enough to split a hair. They stopped at the edge of the camp and crouched behind a cluster of boulders. Stokes pointed. There, in the open ground between 2 shelters, lying in the dust with its great body stretched out in sleep, was the wolf. Even in the darkness, the animal's silver fur seemed to glow, as if it were lit from within by some cold, pale light. Stokes felt a shiver run down his spine. There was something about the wolf that unsettled him. Something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up and his stomach go tight. But he pushed the feeling away. It was just an animal. A big dog. Nothing more. And they were here to do a job. Stokes turned to Vega and nodded. The tracker understood. He drew his skinning knife from his belt and began to move forward, his body low to the ground, his feet making no sound on the packed earth. He was good at this. He had done it many times before, though usually with cattle or horses, not with wolves. But the principle was the same. Get close, be quick, be quiet, and make sure the animal does not have time to make a sound. Vega was 10 feet from the wolf when it happened. Siku opened its eyes, not slowly, not groggily, not the way an animal wakes from deep sleep. The wolf's eyes snapped open like shutters being thrown back, and those pale blue eyes locked onto Vega with a focus and an intelligence that froze the tracker in his tracks. For a single eternal second, man and wolf stared at each other, and in that second, Vega saw something in those ice-colored eyes that he would carry with him for the rest of his short life. He saw understanding. The wolf knew. It knew why they were there. It knew what they had come to do. And it did not run. It did not snarl or growl or bare its teeth. It simply looked at Vega with those knowing, ancient eyes, and the tracker felt, for the first and last time in his life, what it was like to be truly ashamed. But shame was not enough to stop him. Cutter was paying good money, and Vega was not the kind of man who let feelings get in the way of business. He lunged forward, the knife flashing in the darkness, and he drove the blade into the wolf's side. Siku did not cry out. The wolf made a sound, but it was not a howl or a scream. or a whimper. It was something quieter than that. Something worse. It was a sigh. A long, slow, final breath that seemed to carry with it the weight of every moment the animal had ever lived, every sunrise it had watched from the edge of the camp, every night it had spent curled against Kodonai's side, every game it had played with the children, every hunt it had shared, every silent conversation it had held with the quiet, dark-eyed man who had found it dying in the dust and had given it a life. The wolf turned its head, not toward Vega, not toward the knife in its side. It turned toward the shelter where Kodonai slept, and those pale blue eyes found the darkness where the man lay, and for one last heartbeat, the bond between them pulsed with something bright and fierce and unbreakable. And then the light went out. Kodonai woke to the smell of blood. It hit him like a fist, sharp and metallic and wrong, and he was on his feet before his mind fully registered what was happening. He burst out of the shelter and into the night, his bare feet slapping against the hard earth, his eyes wild, his heart slamming against his ribs like a caged animal. And then he saw. He saw the silver body lying in the dust. He saw the dark pool spreading beneath it, black in the moonless dark. He saw the knife still buried in the animal's side, its handle catching a faint gleam from somewhere. And he saw the footprints. 4 sets of boots, heading away from the camp, back toward the boulders, back toward the darkness from which they had come. Kodonai fell to his knees beside the wolf. He gathered the great silver body into his arms and pulled it against his chest, and the animal's head lolled against his shoulder, and its pale blue eyes stared at nothing, and its fur was wet and warm with blood. Kodonai held the wolf, and he did not speak. He did not cry. He did not scream. He made no sound at all. He simply held the animal and rocked back and forth, his dark eyes open and empty, and fixed on some point in the distance that only he could see. The camp woke around him. People came running, drawn by the commotion, and they gathered in a circle around the man and the dead wolf, and they looked at the blood and the knife and the boot prints, and they understood. The women wept. The children hid behind their mothers. The warriors gripped their weapons and looked out into the darkness with hard, angry eyes. But no one spoke. No one dared to speak, because the silence coming from Kodonai was not the silence of grief. It was something else entirely. It was the silence of a storm gathering its strength, the silence of a fire before it explodes, the silence of a man who is crossing a line that can never be uncrossed. Grey Feather, the old chief, came forward and knelt beside Kodonai. He placed a hand on the young man's shoulder and spoke softly, gently, the way you would speak to a wounded animal. He said that he was sorry. He said that the wolf had been a good companion, a noble creature, and that its spirit would find peace in the hunting grounds beyond the sky. He said that they would find the men who did this, and they would seek justice, but that justice must be measured and wise and not driven by anger. Kodonai turned his head and looked at the old chief. And Grey Feather, who had seen many things in his long life, who had watched men die in battle, and women weep over lost children, and warriors return from raids with the light gone from their eyes. Grey Feather looked into Kodonai's face and felt something he had not felt in many, many years. He felt afraid, because the man kneeling in the dust was not the quiet, watchful boy he had known. The man kneeling in the dust was something new, something that had been born in the moment the knife had entered the wolf's body. Something that looked out at the world through Kodonai's dark eyes with a cold, steady, terrible focus. No, Kodonai said. It was the first word he had spoken, and it was the only word he needed. No to patience, no to wisdom, no to measured justice, no to everything the old chief was offering. Just no. He laid the wolf's body gently on the ground and stood up. He walked to his shelter and came out a moment later with the Colt revolver in his belt, and a second one, a gun he had taken from a dead soldier months earlier, tucked into a holster he had made himself from cowhide. 2 revolvers, 12 bullets. He walked back to the wolf's body and knelt again, and he pressed his forehead against the animal's still warm fur, and he stayed there for a long moment, breathing in the scent of the creature he had loved more than anything in the world. Then he stood up. He looked at the boot prints in the dirt. He studied them carefully, reading them the way his father had taught him, noting the depth and the spacing and the direction, and the way the heels dug into the earth. 4 men, moving fast, heading southwest, toward the plains, toward Cutter's Ranch. He memorized every detail, and then he turned and walked out of the camp without looking back. Grey Feather called after him. The warriors called after him. His mother, who had come to the edge of the camp with tears streaming down her face, called after him. But Kodonai did not stop. He did not turn. He walked into the darkness like a man walking into water, and the night swallowed him whole. And the people of the camp stood in the silence he left behind and knew, with a certainty that settled in their bones like winter cold, that something had been set in motion that could not be stopped. Kodonai tracked the four men through the night. He moved across the desert floor like something that was not quite human, his bare feet finding the trail in the darkness with a sureness that would have seemed impossible to anyone watching. But no one was watching. He was alone in the vast empty night, and the only sounds were the whisper of his feet on the sand and the steady, rhythmic beating of his heart. The animals were tied to a mesquite tree at the base of the mountain, and they were nervous, stamping their feet and rolling their eyes, as if they could smell the blood on the air. Kodonai walked past them without stopping. He did not need horses. Horses were loud and clumsy and left tracks that could be followed. He needed only his feet and his eyes, and the cold, burning thing that now lived inside his chest where his heart used to be. By dawn, he had followed the trail to the edge of Cutter's ranch. He lay on his belly in the tall grass and watched the ranch house and the outbuildings and the corrals from a distance. He counted the men. He studied their movements, their routines, the way they carried their weapons, the way they walked and talked and ate their breakfast. He identified Stokes immediately. The tall, thin man with the hatchet face was standing on the porch of the bunkhouse, drinking coffee and talking to the young one, the nervous kid with the Texas drawl. Stokes was laughing. He was telling a story, and Kodonai could tell from the man's gestures, from the way he mimed a stabbing motion with his hand, that the story was about the wolf. The man was laughing about killing his wolf. Kodonai watched Stokes laugh, and he felt the thing inside his chest grow hotter, grow larger, grow teeth and claws and a hunger that would not be satisfied with anything less than blood, but he did not move. Not yet. He was not a fool. He knew that Cutter had many men, that the ranch was well guarded, that a frontal assault would be suicide. He needed to be smart. He needed to be patient. He needed to wait for the right moment and then strike with the speed and precision that his father had taught him, and that the spirits had gifted him. So he waited. He lay in the grass all day, not eating, not drinking, not moving, watching the ranch with those dark, empty eyes. And when the sun began to go down and the shadows began to lengthen, and the men began to drift toward the bunkhouse for supper, Kodonai began to move. He started with Vega. The tracker had left the ranch house after supper and walked out to the corral to check on the horses. He was alone. The other men were inside, eating and drinking and playing cards. Vega leaned against the fence and rolled a cigarette and put it in his mouth and struck a match. And in a brief flare of light, he saw something that made the match fall from his fingers. He saw Kodonai. The Apache gunslinger was standing less than 10 feet away, as still and silent as a shadow, his dark eyes fixed on Vega's face with an expression that was beyond anger, beyond hatred, beyond anything the tracker had ever seen in another human being's eyes. Vega's hand went to the knife on his belt. The same knife he had used to kill the wolf, the same blade that still had traces of Siku's blood on it. But before his fingers could close around the handle, Kodonai spoke. "You used that knife," he said. His voice was quiet, calm, almost gentle. "You pushed it into her side. She looked at me." "She looked at me while she was dying. Did you know that? Did you see that?" Vega's mouth opened, but no words came out. His face had gone white, and his eyes were wide, and his hand was shaking so badly that he could not grip the knife. "She did not cry," Kodonai said. "She did not fight. She just looked at me. And then she was gone." He paused. "I want you to know something. I want you to understand. What is about to happen to you, to all of you, is not revenge. Revenge is a human thing. This is something older. This is a debt, and I am here to collect." Vega finally got the knife free. He lunged forward with a desperate, clumsy swipe, and Kodonai moved. He moved like water. He moved like smoke. He moved like something the human eye was not designed to follow. One moment he was standing still, and the next moment he was beside Vega, and the next moment the tracker was on the ground with his own knife in his chest, his eyes staring up at the darkening sky, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from a river. He felt nothing. No satisfaction, no relief, no guilt. He felt only the burning thing in his chest, and it had not gotten smaller. If anything, it had grown. 1 down, 3 to go. He left Vega's body by the corral and moved toward the bunkhouse. Through the window, he could see the other men sitting around a long wooden table, eating stew and drinking whiskey. Billy Pardee, the young Texan, was shuffling a deck of cards. Frank Holt was cleaning a rifle. And at the head of the table, leaning back in his chair with his long legs stretched out and a thin smile on his hatchet face, was Virgil Stokes. Code and I counted the men in the room. There were 7, not including the 3 he was hunting. 7 men, plus Stokes and Pardee and Holt. 10 men total. 10 men with guns, in a closed room, in a building he did not know. The odds were impossible. Any sane man would have walked away, but Kodonai was no longer sane. Sanity had left him in the moment he had held Siku's body and felt the warmth draining from the wolf's fur. What was left was something purer than sanity, something more focused, something that did not calculate odds or weigh risks or consider consequences. It simply moved toward its target with the blind, unstoppable certainty of a river flowing toward the sea. He walked to the front door of the bunkhouse. He did not sneak. He did not creep. He walked, his boots making no sound on the packed earth, his hands hanging loose at his sides, the 2 revolvers resting in their holsters like sleeping snakes. He reached the door and he stopped, and he took 1 breath, and in that breath he saw Siku's face, those pale blue eyes, that final sigh, and the burning thing in his chest roared. He kicked the door open. The room froze. 10 men looked up from their food and their cards and their whiskey, and they saw an Apache man standing in the doorway with the night sky behind him, his dark eyes empty and cold and utterly without mercy. For 1 heartbeat, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The world held its balance on the edge of a knife. And then Kodonai smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was not a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that a man sees once in his life if he is very unlucky. And it is usually the last thing he sees. It was the smile of a man who has lost everything and discovered in the wreckage of his life that there is a terrible freedom in having nothing left to lose. Billy Pardee was the first to go for his gun. The young Texan was fast. Fast enough to have survived 3 gunfights back in Dallas. Fast enough to have earned a reputation as a man you did not want to cross. His hand shot toward the pistol on his hip with the speed of a striking snake. But Kodonai was faster. His right hand moved in a blur, and the Colt cleared the holster and spoke once, a sharp crack that split the air like thunder, and Billy Pardee fell backward off his chair with a hole in the center of his chest and a look of absolute astonishment on his young face. The room exploded. Men dove for cover, knocking over chairs and tables, shouting and cursing, reaching for weapons. Frank Holt swung his rifle around, but Kodonai's left hand had already drawn the second revolver, and before Holt could bring the barrel to bear, 2 bullets caught him in the throat and the shoulder, and he spun like a top and crashed into the wall and slid to the floor, leaving a dark smear on the wood. Kodonai stepped into the room, and what happened next would become the stuff of legend, the kind of story that men would tell in saloons and around campfires for generations, the kind of story that would grow and change and become something larger than the truth, but that would never, no matter how many times it was told, capture the full, terrible reality of what Kodonai did in that bunkhouse. He moved through the room like a force of nature. His revolvers spoke in a steady, rhythmic cadence, the shots spaced with the precision of a heartbeat. Men fired back. Bullets tore through the air around him, shattering windows and splintering wood and punching holes in the walls. But not one of them touched him. It was as if the bullets bent around him, as if the air itself was protecting him, as if some force greater than luck or skill was guiding him through the storm of lead and fire. One by one, the men fell. A cowboy with a shotgun took a bullet between the eyes before he could pull the trigger. A man hiding behind an overturned table caught 2 shots through the wood. Another man, trying to climb out the window, was hit in the back and collapsed half in and half out of the frame, his legs kicking uselessly in the open air. In less than a minute, 7 men were dead or dying on the floor of the bunkhouse. The room was thick with gun smoke, and the air smelled of powder and blood, and the only sounds were the groaning of the wounded and the steady drip of something wet falling from the edge of the table to the floor. And in the middle of it all, standing upright with a revolver in each hand, untouched and unharmed, was Kodonai, the Apache gunslinger, the ghost, the man they should never, ever have provoked. He turned his head, slowly, and his dark, empty eyes found Virgil Stokes. The tall man was pressed against the far wall, his hands raised, his hatchet face grey with fear. His gun was on the floor at his feet. He had dropped it. His hands were shaking. His lips were moving, but no words were coming out. For the first time in his violent, brutal life, Virgil Stokes was afraid. Truly, deeply, desperately afraid. Codenai walked toward him, slowly, each step deliberate and measured and final. The gun smoke parted around him like water around a stone. His eyes never left Stokes's face, and with every step he took, the burning thing in his chest grew brighter and hotter and more demanding. But he did not shoot. Not yet. Because Stokes was the one who had given the order. Stokes was the one who had planned it. Stokes was the one who had stood on that porch and laughed about it, miming the knife stroke with his hand, while the other men grinned and nodded. And Codenai wanted Stokes to understand exactly what was happening and why. He wanted the man to feel, even for a moment, even for a fraction of a second, what Siku had felt in her last moments. He wanted Stokes to know what it was like to be helpless and afraid and alone, with death standing over you and nothing between you and the end but empty air. He stopped 3 feet from Stokes and stared at the man in silence, and the silence stretched on, filling the room like rising water, pressing against the walls and the ceiling, becoming something physical, something suffocating, something that was worse than any violence could ever be. Stokes broke first. His knees buckled and he slid down the wall and sat in the dust and the blood on the floor. And he looked up at Codenai with the eyes of a man who has just realized, at the very end of his life, that every choice he ever made was wrong. "Please," he whispered. Codenai looked down at him, and in that moment, standing over the man who had killed his wolf, with the bodies of the fallen scattered around him like fallen leaves, Codenai made a decision. He holstered one revolver, then the other. He reached down and picked up Stokes's fallen gun and tossed it into the man's lap. "Stand up," he said quietly. "Pick up your gun. Face me like a man. It is more than you gave her." Stokes stared at the gun in his lap. His hands were shaking so badly that he could barely grip it. But somewhere deep inside the ruins of his pride, he found something. Not courage, not honor, just stubbornness, just the refusal to die on his knees. He stood up. He picked up the gun. He looked at Codenai. "Draw when you are ready," Codenai said. Stokes drew. He was fast. 11 men had died learning just how fast Virgil Stokes could draw a pistol. But Codenai was faster. He was always faster. The Colt appeared in his hand as if by magic, and the shot echoed through the ruined bunkhouse like the final word of a prayer. And Virgil Stokes fell forward into the dust with a bullet in his heart and the gun still unfired in his hand. Codenai stood over the body. He looked at the face of the man who had taken everything from him. And he felt the burning thing in his chest shift and change, becoming something different, something heavier, something that was not rage anymore, but something closer to grief. Because the killing was not done. Because Stokes was not the one who had given the final order. Stokes was a weapon, a tool. The hand that wielded the tool was still out there, still breathing, still sleeping in a warm bed in a big house on the other side of the ranch. Elias Cutter, the man who started it all. The man who wanted the mountains and the silver and the land. The man who had looked at a wolf and a man and a people and a way of life and decided, with the casual cruelty of the powerful, that none of it mattered, that all of it could be swept away to make room for his ambitions. Codenai reloaded his revolvers. He stepped over the bodies and walked out of the bunkhouse into the cool night air. The stars had come out, thousands of them scattered across the black sky like sparks from a fire. He looked up at them for a moment and he thought of Siku, and he thought of the old stories his mother had told him about the spirits of animals going to live among the stars. Then he lowered his eyes and looked toward the ranch house. The lights were on. Someone had heard the shooting. He could see a figure moving behind the curtains, and he knew, with the same certainty with which he knew his own name, that the figure was Elias Cutter. He began to walk. The ranch house sat on a small rise at the center of the property, a big 2-story wooden structure with a wide porch and tall windows that glowed yellow with lamplight. It was the kind of house that a man like Elias Cutter built to announce himself to the world, to say, "Look at me. Look at what I have. Look at how powerful I am." It was a house built on stolen land with stolen money, and every plank of wood and every pane of glass and every nail driven into its frame was a monument to greed and cruelty and the absolute certainty that the strong could do whatever they wanted to the weak. Kodunai walked toward the house with the slow, steady stride of a man who has nowhere to hurry to because he knows that what he is walking toward cannot escape. The night air was cold against his skin, and the smell of gun smoke still clung to his clothes and his hair. And behind him, in the ruined bunkhouse, the dead lay in silence and the dying breathed their last. He did not look back. There was nothing behind him now. There was only the road ahead, and at the end of it, the man who had set all of this in motion. As he crossed the open ground between the bunkhouse and the main house, a door on the side of the building opened, and two men came out. They were guards, ranch hands who had been posted at the house to protect Cutter. They saw Kodunai approaching, and they shouted at him, telling him to stop, telling him to put his hands up, reaching for the rifles slung over their shoulders. But Kodunai did not stop. He did not put his hands up. He kept walking, and the men kept shouting, and when they finally raised their rifles and pointed them at his chest, he drew. Both revolvers came out of their holsters in a single fluid motion, and two shots cracked across the night, and the two guards fell where they stood, their rifles clattering to the ground beside them, their bodies crumpling like puppets whose strings had been cut. Kodunai stepped over them and walked up the porch steps. The wooden boards creaked under his feet. He could hear sounds coming from inside the house. A woman's voice, high and frightened, asking questions. A man's voice, deep and angry, barking orders. And beneath those voices, the unmistakable sound of furniture being moved, of doors being locked, of someone preparing for a siege. Kodunai stopped at the front door. It was a heavy door, made of thick oak, with iron hinges and a brass handle. He tried it, locked. He took a step back and looked at the door for a moment, and then he raised his foot and kicked it. The lock shattered, and the door swung inward and slammed against the wall, and Kodunai stepped into the house of the man who had killed his wolf. The inside of the house was exactly what he expected. Rich, decorated, full of things that had been bought with money that did not belong to the man who spent it. There were paintings on the walls and rugs on the floors, and heavy wooden furniture polished to a high shine. There was a staircase leading to the second floor, with a carved banister and thick carpeted steps. There were crystal decanters on a sideboard, filled with amber liquid that caught the lamplight and glowed like liquid gold. It was the house of a man who had everything, and it made Kodunai sick. He moved through the ground floor quickly and efficiently, clearing each room the way a hunter clears brush, checking corners and doorways, listening for movement, watching for threats. In the kitchen, he found a cook hiding under the table, a fat old man with flour on his hands and terror in his eyes. Kodunai looked at him and said, "Go." The cook scrambled out from under the table and ran for the back door and disappeared into the night without looking back. In the study, he found a woman. She was young, maybe 25, with blonde hair and blue eyes and a face that was pale with fear. She was Cutter's wife, or so Kodunai assumed, and she was standing behind a desk with her hands pressed against her mouth and her eyes wide and wet with tears. She looked at Kodunai and she saw the revolvers and the blood on his shirt and the emptiness in his eyes, and she began to sob. "Please," she said, "please do not hurt me. I have not done anything. I did not know what they were going to do. I swear I did not know." Kodunai looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Where is your husband?" "Upstairs," she whispered. "He has a gun. He said he would kill you. He said you are just an Apache, and he would put you down like a dog. Leave this house," he said. "Take a horse from the corral and ride to town. Do not come back until morning." The woman stared at him, disbelief fighting with relief on her tear-stained face. Then she gathered her skirts and hurried past him, giving him a wide berth, keeping her eyes on the revolvers as if they might bite her. And a moment later, Kodunai heard the front door open and close and the sound of running feet on the porch. He was alone in the house now, alone with Elias Cutter. The man was upstairs, behind a locked door, with a gun, waiting. And Kodunai could hear him. He could hear the man's breathing, heavy and ragged. The breathing of a man who is not accustomed to fear and does not know how to handle it. He could hear the man's footsteps pacing back and forth across the floor above, wearing a groove in the expensive carpet. He could hear the click of a hammer being pulled back and the rattle of bullets being loaded into a chamber. Kodunai walked to the staircase and looked up. The second floor was dark. The lamps had been extinguished, and the only light came from the moonlight that filtered through the upstairs windows casting pale rectangles on the walls and floor. He placed his foot on the first step and began to climb. Each step groaned under his weight, announcing his approach like a drumbeat. He made no effort to be quiet. He wanted Cutter to hear him. He wanted the man to listen to each step and count them, and know that with every creak of wood, the distance between them was shrinking. He wanted Cutter to feel what Siku had felt in those final moments, the helpless, inescapable approach of something that could not be reasoned with, could not be bargained with, could not be bought or threatened or turned aside. At the top of the stairs, a hallway stretched in both directions, 3 doors on the left, 2 on the right, all closed. Kodonai stood in the hallway and listened. The breathing was coming from behind the last door on the left. He walked toward it, his footsteps deliberate and slow, and he stopped in front of the door and stood there in silence. From inside the room, he heard a voice. Cutter's voice. It was trying to be strong, trying to be commanding, trying to be the voice of a man who was used to giving orders and having them obeyed. But underneath the bluster, there was a crack, a fracture, a tremor that betrayed the truth of what Elias Cutter was feeling. "You come through that door and I will blow your head off," Cutter said. "You hear me? I got a shotgun aimed right at that door. You come through, and you are a dead man."
Kodonai said nothing. He stood in the hallway and waited.
And the silence did its work. He could hear Cutter shifting on the other side of the door, adjusting his grip on the weapon, licking his dry lips, blinking sweat out of his eyes. The man's composure was dissolving. The certainty that had carried him through life, the certainty that his money and his power and his connections made him untouchable, was crumbling away like dry earth in a flood. A minute passed. 2 minutes. 3. The silence became unbearable. "What do you want?" Cutter shouted. His voice was higher now, thinner. "Money? I got money. I got more money than you have ever seen. You want land? I will give you land. I will give you whatever you want. Just name it. Name your price." Kodonai listened to the man offer everything he had, and he thought about Siku. He thought about the way the wolf used to press its cold nose against his hand in the mornings. He thought about the way its pale blue eyes would catch the firelight and glow like 2 small moons. He thought about the sound of its breathing at night, steady and deep and reassuring, the sound that had meant he was not alone in the world. And he thought about the price that Cutter was asking him to name, and he realized that there was no price, not because what he had lost was priceless, although it was, but because the thing he wanted could not be bought or given or traded. The thing he wanted was already gone. It was lying in the dust back at the camp, its silver fur matted with blood, its pale eyes closed forever. No amount of money, no amount of land, no amount of anything could bring it back. "Open the door!" Kodonai said quietly. "Go to hell!" Cutter snarled. Kodonai took a step back. Then he raised his foot and kicked the door, and the wood splintered and the lock gave way and the door flew open. And in the same instant the shotgun roared. The blast tore through the doorway and blew a hole in the wall behind where Kodonai had been standing a fraction of a second earlier. But Kodonai was no longer there. He had moved to the side at the moment of the kick, pressing himself flat against the hallway wall, and the shotgun's payload had passed through empty air. Before Cutter could reload, Kodonai stepped into the room. It was a bedroom. A big, opulent bedroom with a 4-poster bed and silk curtains, and a wardrobe the size of a small cabin. Elias Cutter was standing behind the bed, using it as a barricade, the empty shotgun in his hands, his big red face shining with sweat, his small, mean eyes darting back and forth like trapped animals. He was a big man, bigger than Kodonai, with broad shoulders and thick arms and the kind of physical presence that intimidated most people. But in this room, in this moment, his size meant nothing. He was just a man with an empty gun and a room full of expensive things that could not protect him. Kodonai stood in the doorway and looked at him. 2 revolvers hung at his sides, not drawn, not raised. He did not need them, not yet. He wanted to look at this man. He wanted to see the face of the person who had decided that a wolf's life was worth nothing, that an Apache man's love was worth nothing, that the bond between a creature and its companion was an obstacle to be removed, like a rock in a road or a tree in a field. "You killed my wolf," Kodonai said. The words were simple, plain. There was no drama in them, no theatrical rage, no grand declaration, just a statement of fact, delivered in the quiet, steady voice of a man who has moved beyond emotion into something colder and clearer. Cutter stared at him, and in that moment, the rancher's face went through a series of expressions that told the whole story of his life. First, there was confusion. A wolf. All of this was about a wolf. This man had killed a dozen of his men, shot his way through his ranch like a one-man army, kicked down his doors and driven his wife into the night, all because of a wolf. The confusion lasted for about 2 seconds, and then it was replaced by something else. Understanding. Because Elias Cutter was not a stupid man. He was cruel and he was greedy and he was ruthless, but he was not stupid. And looking into Codenai's eyes, he understood something that Virgil Stokes had never understood, that Billy Pardee and Frank Holt and Miguel Vega had never understood, that all the dead men in the bunkhouse had never understood. The wolf was not a pet. The wolf was not an animal. The wolf was everything. It was family and friend and purpose and meaning and home. It was the thing that had anchored Codenai to the world, the thing that had given him a reason to wake up in the morning and a reason to lie down at night, the thing that had made the loneliness and the hardship and the injustice of his life bearable, and they had taken it away. They had killed it for no reason other than that it was convenient. They had murdered the only light in this man's life and expected there to be no consequences. Cutter lowered the empty shotgun. His arms fell to his sides, and the weapon dangled from his fingers like a broken branch. He looked at Codenai, and for the first time in his life, Elias Cutter saw another human being. Not an Apache, not a savage, not an obstacle or a resource or a problem to be solved. A human being. A man in pain. A man who had lost something so precious that the loss had turned him into a force of nature, a storm in the shape of a man, a grief so vast and so deep that it had swallowed everything else and left nothing behind but purpose. I did not know, Cutter said. His voice was different now. The bluster was gone. The command was gone. What was left was just a man's voice, tired and afraid, and underneath it all, ashamed. I did not know what it meant to you. I just thought it was a way to weaken you, to scare you off the land. I wanted the silver in those mountains, and your people were in the way, and Stokes said killing the wolf would break your spirit, and I said yes because it seemed like such a small thing, such an easy thing. I did not think about what it meant. I did not think about you at all. No, Codenai said. You did not. The room was very quiet. Outside, the wind had picked up, and it moved through the eaves of the house with a low, mournful sound, like a song being sung in a language that no one alive could understand. The lamplight flickered. Shadows danced on the walls, and 2 men stood facing each other across a wide bed in a room full of expensive things, and between them lay the invisible body of a silver wolf with pale blue eyes. Codenai drew his revolver, not fast, not with the lightning speed that had killed a dozen men that night. Slowly, deliberately. He drew the weapon and held it at his side and looked at Cutter, and the rancher looked at the gun and then looked at the man holding it, and something passed between them. Something wordless and heavy and final. Pick up the shotgun, Codenai said. Cutter looked down at the weapon in his hand. It is empty, he said. I know. Cutter stared at him. And then, slowly, something changed in the rancher's face. The fear did not leave. The shame did not leave. But something else appeared. Something small and unexpected and, in its own terrible way, almost noble. It was acceptance. Elias Cutter was a lot of things. He was a thief and a liar, and a man who had built his life on the suffering of others. But he was not a coward, not at the very end. He was not a man who would beg, not when he knew that begging would not help, not when he understood, with a clarity that surprised even himself, that what was happening to him was not random cruelty or senseless violence, but something much older and much more powerful. It was justice, the real kind. The kind that does not come from courts or laws or governments. The kind that comes from the earth itself, from the deep places where right and wrong are not matters of opinion, but matters of fact. Cutter straightened his back. He set the empty shotgun on the bed. He smoothed his shirt and ran his fingers through his sweat-damp hair. And then he looked at Codenai and nodded. I understand, he said. Do what you came to do. And then he stopped. He stood there with the gun pointed at the center of Cutter's chest, his finger on the trigger, his eyes locked on the man's face, and he did not fire. Seconds passed. The wind howled outside. The lamp flame guttered and almost went out, and still Kodunai did not fire. Because in that moment, standing in that ridiculous, opulent bedroom, with the smell of blood and gun smoke clinging to him like a second skin, Kodunai heard something, not with his ears. With the part of him that had always been connected to Siku, the part that had known the wolf's thoughts and felt the wolf's feelings and shared the wolf's silent, beautiful understanding of the world. He heard the wolf's voice, not words. Wolves do not speak in words, but a feeling, a warmth, a nudge gentle and familiar, like a cold nose pressing against his hand in the early morning light. And the feeling said, enough, enough blood, enough death, enough rage. The men who had held the knife were dead. The men who had laughed about the killing were dead. The debt had been paid. And what was left? The man standing in front of him, trembling and ashamed and waiting for a bullet, was not a monster. He was just a man. A small, foolish, frightened man who had made a terrible mistake and who would have to live with the weight of that mistake for the rest of his life. And living with it, Kodunai realized, with a certainty that came from somewhere deeper than his own mind, living with it would be a punishment far worse than dying. Kodunai lowered the revolver. He looked at Cutter for a long, silent moment, and then he spoke, and the words he said would be carved into the history of the Arizona Territory, like letters cut into stone. You will live, he said, but you will know for the rest of your days that you are alive, because a wolf showed more mercy than you ever did. He holstered the revolver. He turned and walked out of the bedroom, through the hallway, down the stairs and out the front door of the house. He walked across the porch and down the steps and across the open ground, past the bodies of the guards, past the dark and silent bunkhouse, past the corrals where the horses stamped and snorted, and out into the desert night. He walked for a long time. He walked until the ranch was far behind him, and the mountains were ahead of him, and the sky above him was vast and black and full of stars. And as he walked, he felt the burning thing in his chest begin to change. It did not disappear. It did not go away, but it transformed, slowly and painfully, from rage into something else, into sadness, into loss, into the deep, aching, endless grief of a man who has lost the one thing in the world that made him whole. He stopped walking when he reached the top of a ridge. Below him, the desert stretched out in every direction, silver and shadow in the starlight. Above him, the sky was infinite. He stood on that ridge and he looked up at the stars, and he searched for the one that was Siku. His mother had told him that the spirits of animals became stars, that when a creature you loved died, it went to the sky and watched over you from above, and that if you looked carefully enough, you could find it. You could find it because it would be the brightest one, the one that shone a little differently from all the others, the one that seemed to be looking right at you, with pale blue eyes the color of ice in winter. Kodunai looked at the sky for a long time, and then, slowly, he sat down on the ridge and pulled his knees to his chest and wrapped his arms around himself the way he used to wrap himself around the wolf on cold nights. And for the first time since Siku's death, he allowed himself to feel not the rage, not the cold, empty fury that had carried him through the night, but the grief, the real, raw, honest grief of a man who has loved and lost and knows that the loss is forever. He did not cry. That was not his way, but the grief moved through him like a river, vast and powerful and unstoppable, and it carried with it every memory of Siku, the pup in the dust, trembling and dying. The first time it had stood on its own legs and looked at him with those blue eyes, the way it would tilt its head when he spoke, as if it was listening not to his words but to the meaning behind them. The weight of its body against his when they slept, the sound of its paws on the hard earth, the way the sunlight caught its silver fur and turned it to white gold. Every moment, every memory, every precious, irreplaceable second of the life they had shared. The story of what happened that night spread like wildfire across the territory. The Apache gunslinger, the ghost, the man who had walked into a ranch full of armed men and walked out the other side with barely a scratch. The man who had killed a dozen men in a single night to avenge a wolf. The man who had stood over his enemy with a loaded gun and chosen mercy over murder. The stories grew and changed and became legend, and in the saloons and the army forts and the mining camps and the Apache settlements, people spoke Kodunai's name in whispers. Elias Cutter survived, as Kodunai had intended. But the man who walked out of that bedroom the next morning was not the same man who had walked in. The rancher abandoned his claim on the mountain lands. He sold his cattle and dismissed his remaining workers and closed down the ranch. His wife left him within the year, unable to live with a man who would wake screaming in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, his eyes wild, shouting about wolves and stars and Apache ghosts. Cotter moved to Tucson and then to California, drifting from town to town, drinking too much, talking too little, carrying the weight of what he had done like a stone chained to his ankle. He lived for another 23 years, and people who knew him during those years said that he was never the same, that there was something broken in him, something that could not be fixed, and that, sometimes, on quiet nights, he would look up at the sky and search the stars with a desperate, haunted expression, as if he was looking for something he hoped he would never find. As for Kodonai, he returned to his tribe. He walked into the camp at dawn, his clothes stained with blood and dust, his revolvers heavy at his sides, and the people of the camp gathered around him in silence. They did not cheer. They did not celebrate. They looked at his face and they saw the cast of what he had done, and they understood that what had happened was not a victory. It was a reckoning, and reckonings, even righteous ones, leave scars that never fully heal. He went to the place where Siku's body lay. The women of the camp had cleaned the blood from the wolf's fur and laid the body on a bed of sage and juniper, and the pale blue eyes had been closed, and the great silver body looked peaceful, as if it were merely sleeping. Kodonai knelt beside the wolf one last time. He placed his hand on the animal's head, and the fur was cold now, and still, and the steady heartbeat that he had felt 1,000 times was gone. He stayed there for a long time, his hand on the wolf's head, his dark eyes closed, his lips moving in words that no one could hear. Then he stood up and went to work. He built a burial platform, the kind the Apache built for their greatest warriors, high above the ground where the eagles flew and the wind sang. He carried the wolf's body to the top of the platform himself, wrapping it in the finest blanket he owned, surrounding it with sage and cedar and the dried flowers that his mother used in her healing ceremonies. And when the body was settled and the prayers had been spoken, and the smoke from the sacred fire had carried the last of the offerings up to the sky, Kodonai stood at the base of the platform and made a promise. He promised that he would live, not just survive, live. He promised that he would honor the wolf's memory, not with more killing, not with more rage, not with more destruction, but with the simple daily act of getting up in the morning and walking through the world with his eyes open and his heart beating and his spirit intact. Because that was what Siku would have wanted. The wolf had not cared about revenge or justice or the balance of debts. The wolf had cared about one thing and one thing only. It had cared about the man who had found it dying in the dust and had given it a life. And the best way to honor that care was to keep living. And so he did. Kodonai lived for many more years after that night. He fought in more battles and survived more hardships and watched the world change in ways that would have been unimaginable to the boy who had found a dying wolf pup at the edge of the camp. The Apache Wars ended. The reservations came. The old ways died, one by one, like embers in a fire, and a new world rose from the ashes, complicated and cruel, and sometimes, in unexpected moments, beautiful. Through it all, Kodonai carried two things with him. The first was his revolvers, which he wore until the day he died, though he never fired them again in anger after that night. The second was a small piece of silver fur, cut from Siku's coat and tied with a leather cord around his neck. He wore it against his skin, close to his heart, and he never took it off. Not once. Not ever. People who met him in his later years said that there was something about the man that was hard to describe. A quietness, a depth, a sense that he had been to places, inside himself and in the world, that most people would never go and could never understand. They said his eyes were dark and watchful and kind, and that when he spoke, which was not often, his words had a weight and a wisdom that made people stop and listen. And they said that sometimes on quiet nights, when the stars were out and the desert was still, you could see him sitting alone at the edge of wherever he was, looking up at the sky with an expression that was equal parts sadness and love and gratitude. And if you followed his gaze, if you looked where he was looking, you would see a single star, brighter than the rest, burning with a pale blue light the color of ice in winter. And sometimes, the old ones said, if you were very quiet and very still, and you listened with your heart instead of your ears, you could hear a sound coming from that star. A sound like breathing. A sound like padded feet on soft earth. A sound like a wolf walking through the hunting grounds beyond the sky. waiting patiently for the day when its companion would come to join it. The people of the territory remembered Kodunai for many things. They remembered the night he walked into a ranch full of armed men and walked out the other side. They remembered the speed of his hands and the accuracy of his aim and the terrible, beautiful fury of his wrath. But the thing they remembered most, the thing that was passed down from generation to generation, from parent to child, from elder to young warrior, was not the killing, it was the mercy. The moment when the Apache gunslinger stood over his last enemy with a loaded gun and a broken heart and chose to let the man live, because that, the old ones said, was the truest measure of strength. Not the ability to destroy, but the ability to stop. To look into the face of the man who has taken everything from you and say, "This is enough." To put down the gun and walk away and choose life over death, not because you are weak, but because you are strong enough to know the difference. They thought it was a small thing, an easy thing, a thing without consequences. They thought the quiet man at the edge of the camp was nobody. They thought his wolf was just an animal. They thought wrong, and by the time they realized their mistake, by the time they saw the smile on the Apache gunslinger's face and heard the click of the hammer being pulled back, it was far, far too late. Some debts can be paid with money. Some debts can be forgiven with time. But some debts, the old one said, can only be paid in full. And the man who collected them walked through this world with a piece of silver fur against his heart, and the light of a pale blue star in his dark, quiet eyes. And he never, not once, not ever, forgot the wolf who had made him who he was.